Welcome to the Weaver Sews. I'm Daryl Lancaster. I've been weaving fabric for garments for a long time. Occasionally, I like to push the rules, more to just see what will happen. There are unwritten, or maybe they are written in some of my early weaving manuals, rules about mixing fibers in a warp, and I usually just ignore that. Or I push the limits on common sense. I weave a lot of mixed warp yardage. This summer shirt here is a combination of hand-dyed rayon and cotton yarns with some commercial additions, but all of the warp yarns are in the cellulose family. Yes, rayon is a regenerated cellulose manufactured into a yarn. In this jacket, made from the leftovers from the swing coat on the mannequin behind me, I've used assorted wools. They are all hand-dyed, but they are all proteins. Mixed wool and mohair, different size yarns, different textures, but all protein fibers. Since they were all dyed by me, they had been through a heat process and then washed before they ever went onto the loom. This coat was woven with mixed cellulose yarns, rayons, and cottons, all hand painted in the warp, but the weft was a merino wool and silk combination. If I mix a protein and cellulose fiber in a yardage, I usually put one in the warp and the other in the weft. I rarely, if ever, have differential shrinkage issues. Even if I combine pre-washed yarns with commercial ones direct from cones, it usually isn't a problem. And you will note that design areas with different yarns are typically not more than an inch or so wide, usually less than 4 centimeters. So if there was an issue with one yarn, it would be spread out and minimal. Still, I'm curious. I wouldn't intentionally place a 4-inch or 10 centimeter wide stripe of cotton next to a 4-inch or 10 centimeter wide stripe of wool in the same warp. But I thought that if, the yarn had a protein content and was mixed in with other like things, I'd probably be somewhat safe. So here is a story of a spectacularly gorgeous, if I say so myself, hand-dyed plaid warp using a few dozen different yarns that didn't work out the way I intended. This warp was a challenge to weave. I took all my hand-dyed wools, assorted protein fibers, and I know they are all protein fibers because I used acid dyes to dye them, and acid dyes don't work on cellulose yarns. To show the process and give you a little backstory, I started with a bunch of hand-dyed skeins. I knew they were all protein by feel and from the way they took the acid dyes. Once the skeins were wound into cakes, I played around with the order, grouping into like complementary colorways. I did a lot of calculating as to how many yards were in each cake. I took lots and lots of notes. I carefully laid everything out for the block sequences in weaving software. I set up my loom, spreading the twill structure over 8 shafts to prevent sticking and skipped threads. I printed out a very specific treadling repeat with yarn samples, which I had taped across the castle and the end of the beater since I ran out of room. Once I started weaving, I did end up reslaying to a different size reed, but I plowed forth and started weaving this painstakingly slow but gorgeous yardage. The plaid was broken up into 3 distinct blocks: A, B, C, B, A, B, C, B, A. The problem, turns out, was block C. That's the one with the turquoise color running through it. Weaving was slow with so many weft changes, but it all wove beautifully. Of course, I had help. Everything looked fine when the 7 yards or so came off the loom, and then I washed it. Not too aggressively, but warm water, mild agitation, the usual. All looked fine. I put it in a low dryer to take out the worst of the dampness and get a bit of fulling. And that's where the problem happened. So Block C was comprised of a group of like yarns that I knew had a protein content, but weren't completely protein. There was a shiny yarn that did not take the dye, which I'm going to guess is probably rayon or tencel. It wouldn't have been silk, since silk would have taken the acid dye well. And I'm guessing by feel that the protein part was actually something like alpaca, which doesn't full as easily as wool. So alpaca tencel. I had a bunch of colors in this particular yarn, so I grouped them together into a really pretty Block C. And because the other blocks were mostly sheep wools and mohairs, they fulled the way I intended. And Block C did not. Since the block ran weft-wise and warp-wise, I had these lovely chunky bands of Block C that didn't appear to shrink at all. 7 yards worth. Disappointing? Yes. Surprising? No. I sat on the dilemma for a while because I would never consider this yardage unusable, but I had to think hard about how to salvage it. I started playing with one of the edges just to see if the warps could be drawn up and evened out. Because they had a smoother scale structure than other protein fibers in the yardage, they didn't latch on to their neighbors. So I found that with gentle nudging of every other warp end in Block C, I could smooth out the bubbling of the block and get it to behave and play well with the other blocks. I wouldn't even attempt to do this with the entire yardage, but I could cut out the pieces for the garment, reducing the area that I'd need to draw up. So I overcut each of the garment sections. I left about a 1 inch or 2.5 centimeter border all the way around the garment section. With a pair of tweezers, while the section was still on the pattern piece, I began drawing up every other warp or weft end in Block C, taking advantage of all 4 edges of each pattern. I was thrilled with the results. Once the fabric was nice and flat, I recut the garment section to the original pattern dimensions, added the tailor's tacks, and then gave it a good press. I now have a nicely even block plaid, and I can't wait to show you what I'm going to make with it. I'm Daryl Lancaster for the Weaver Sews.